Welcome to a special edition of TyskySour. Of course, we are having a show on Monday night because results for last week's European elections were released. It's fair to say it was an unalloyed hammering for the major parties. The Tories finished fifth with 9.1% of the votes, their worst result since 1832. That's 1832. Labour were beaten by the Lib Dems, finishing third with only 14.1% of the vote. And the big winners were, of course, the 2-month-old Brexit Party. What do the results mean for Brexit? Is mainstream conservatism dead? And can Labour any longer contain its internal contradictions? Now largely being played out on the pages of The Guardian's Comment is Free. Who better to answer these questions than Novara Media's MVPs, Aaron Bastani. Hello.
What's up, Michael? How you doing?
I'm very well. And Ash Sarkar.
Do I get a wolf whistle? I very politely did it for you.
You might be the only person who can do a wolf whistle.
I think it's sort of affirmative sort of gender empowerment if a woman is allowed
cool
to harangue a man, but not vice versa.
I just have to sit here on wolf whistled. Fine.
Did anyone stay up to watch the results?
I stayed up till about midnight, so I saw quite a lot of them come in.
I gave up at about midnight. I was like, why not just wake up in the morning and find out then?
Yeah, I mean, that's
there
the
was
thing.
too much faff.
Yeah, it's a lot of faff.
Anyway, what do these results mean for the major parties? I'm going to start with Aaron.
I just want to say I stayed up till 5 a.m.
No. Writing your piece. It's very good.
Novara Media, novaramedia.com. You can go check it out. It's up on our website.
It's a very good piece.
Oh, thank you very much, Ash. I was kind of tired. I'm kind of surprised it's so coherent. So no, it was just a kind of impressionistic first take on what happened. But most results were in by like 3 a.m. So it wasn't like a general election. You didn't need to kill yourself to see what was happening. Although that said,
it wasn't all hanging on Canterbury.
Yeah, it was all pretty clear what was happening by midnight, right? By 11 o'clock. So you're asking me...
Your headline was that you now think a second referendum is more likely.
I think there's going to have to be an electoral event because we have to leave by October 31st. The only way that the EU will give us an extension is with an electoral event. Go on, Ash.
I mean, I think one of the things that we should lay out before we get into what Labour should do, how the left should respond, so on and so forth, because that's the nature of what we talk about. We should say that while Labour did have a bad night, the Tories had a historically catastrophic one, and unlike Labour, they don't have a way out of it. I think in terms of the reaction that we'll see from the Conservative Party, witnessing a huge portion of its vote share get eaten up by the Brexit Party it's not going to be a rational response. It's going to be a very paranoid response. So even though the parliamentary party won't be able to deliver a no-deal Brexit because the Parliamentary Conservative Party very much doesn't want one, the rest of Parliament very much doesn't want a no-deal Brexit, you will have leadership candidates taking harder and harder lines until you end up with Dominic Raab saying he's going to karate chop our way out the EU or some shit like that, just because they'll be wanting to appease their furious grassroots and also those portions of its electoral base. The problem they'll come up again and again will be parliamentary arithmetic. There's no way out of it which doesn't present the possibility of a split for the Conservative Party, I think, while in government. Whereas the Labour Party faces some very difficult choices. One of the things that I was talking about with Novara's very own James Butler when he was in the studio not an hour ago was that Labour has a real problem here, because the pivot towards a second referendum and a more of a Remain position, it is making a judgment of value on one half of its electoral coalition over another, and we need to be honest about it.
I think it's actually worse than that because 2/3 of Labour seats voted leave and 2/3 of their targets voted leave. So it would basically be an admission that Labour's not going to form majority government. I mean, that's basically what it would be. Now, that doesn't mean Jeremy Corbyn can't be Prime Minister. It may well work out that, I don't know if you guys saw the numbers, there was that crazy poll where Labour got 21%, Lord Ashcroft poll. Yet
coming
they gained,
first with 21%.
Yeah, but they got 6 extra seats. Lib Dems got like 100 seats. In that instance, it would be a very strong coalition government, right? I mean, it's not nice to talk about, but you'd still get Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister. You might be able to buy the Lib Dems off with some electoral reform, second referendum, etc. And there's a lot of good things to offer people there.
See, I think that there's a little bit
Can I just finish, though, because I haven't actually made the point, though.
Oh, okay, yeah, but I didn't finish my point either.
No, but you came back to me.
No, you
okay.
said, can I go in? Okay.
Finish your point, then you finish your
go on.
point.
Really
Ash.
very quickly, which is in terms of the value judgment that's being made, because one of the assumptions we always make is that to win over Leave voting Tory marginals will need to appeal to Labour leavers. The data breakdown from Warwick shortly after the 26th referendum showed quite decisively that the single most useful determining factor for working out whether or not someone voted Leave or Remain was whether or not they voted Conservative or Labour. That doesn't mean you don't have to win over Labour leavers, of course you do, but I think that there's a little bit of a category error that we make. But in terms of the value judgment that we are making, it's that we are seeing a move away from Labour being able to offer political solutions, constitutional solutions, which speak to the entirety of the country, of a nationwide working movement. It's saying that its political direction, if not its economic direction, will be the preserve of metropolitan social liberals, and that's actually a huge step away from its origins, and that's something that we have to grapple with.
Aaron, you
Please,
finish
go
your
on.
point.
You know, I did actually interrupt Ash, but not. I wasn't. I was basically trying to build. This is what brown people do. We try and build on each other's points by interrupting one another. It wasn't that kind of interruption, but you're right.
This is how you can tell that you're only half Iranian, though, because you didn't do enough hands in there.
Yeah.
Whereas if you were Bengali, it would be all hands.
Yeah. I just don't think that the numbers are there if Labour back a second referendum. That's not to say they shouldn't, right? Because Jeremy Corbyn, I still think, even with the terrible numbers from last night, Jeremy Corbyn would still be the Prime Minister. That's not to say they shouldn't. You might think there are bigger imperatives at play. You might say, well, look, Labour needs to remake its electoral coalition. These are all different arguments. But the idea that off the back of that, a pivot to a second referendum would make it any easier for them to form a government, I think that's not true. I think it would clearly make it harder to form a government. And it will almost certainly entail having to go in coalition with people. Now, what's the alternative? Not going towards a second referendum. What would be happening? The reason why I'm quite worried for Labour and why I think they probably will have to ultimately is because last night they lost votes to 4 parties. Not 1 or 2, 4. The Greens, the Lib Dems, the SNP and the Brexit Party. And obviously we know in Scotland Labour need to win back seats. They need to win back at least 10 seats to be competitive to form majority government. And when that's happening, and they're not going to take many seats off the Tories, let's be real, right? When that's happening, they clearly have no chance of forming government whatsoever under those conditions. So I think the pivot to a second referendum is possibly wise, but that isn't to say that it's going to necessarily lead out to some electoral advantage that they don't presently have. I think maybe we might look back on 2017 and say, actually, that was the best opportunity for a Labour majority government. Potentially.
I think in terms of media response, so I suppose what's odd is because Theresa May resigned last week, the fact that the Tories have had their worst results since 1832 hasn't really come with it the same sort of infighting that's come with Labour, because they've already had their explosive moment, which is getting rid of their leader. It looks like most of the leading leadership candidates now are going to be taking on a kind of Brexit Party position to try and eat up that vote. We can talk a bit about whether that will be possible. You're saying that will come into conflict with parliamentary arithmetic, and to take up a Brexit position, a Brexit Party no deal position, will ultimately be impossible, I suppose, unless you back a people's vote or something along those lines, or a general election, which could ultimately be self-defeating for whatever Conservative Party leader comes into play. But Labour, I mean, there's been some quite vicious infighting, and I suppose that's because Labour still has its leader, it still has its major personnel in place that it's had for 2 years, and this is one of those moments where those internal tensions erupt. And we've seen, I mean, in divisions within the shadow cabinet. So Emily Thornberry was going on TV saying Labour screwed up the campaign basically because we had an ambiguous position when it came to Brexit. We should have backed a second referendum and we should have committed to remain. You've got commentators, Paul Mason, friend of the show, coming out strongly against individuals. He's coming out against Seamus Milne, Carrie Murphy, Ian Lavery. I don't know how far you think this internal fight is going to grow. I mean, is the cat out of the bag? Are we even looking at a coup 2.0? How do you see this internal fight within the Labour Party that's suddenly become very public play out in this situation?
So here's the thing, is that I think we need to be honest about the performance of the Labour Party during these elections, because many of the problems are, of course, the result of its Brexit position, which was really trying to shape a kind of consensus for a soft Brexit, bring people together. But it was also, in my view, a very poor campaign. And it was a very poor campaign for three reasons. One was that MEP candidates up and down the country really did report being incredibly unsupported. The campaign materials that they got would have the wrong name of the city, wrong day for voting, all that kind of thing. So there was a level of message control that was coming from the very top of the party, but it wasn't competently executed, and that's a real problem. The second thing is that it went in with trying to do two campaigns at once, neither of which I think really spoke to the political moment effectively. So the sort of campaign launch was a reiteration of the core Labour message about rebuilding Britain for the many, not the few, which is fantastic. I agree with it. It's an amazing message for a general election. And what it didn't do is tell you how Labour feel about sitting in a European Parliament, what a vote for them means for sitting in European Parliament or not sitting in European Parliament. So it's trying to, tap dance at like a drill gig. It's just sort of, that's nice, but that's not for now.
Can I ask you a question?
And then the third thing very quickly, which I think Labour got wrong, which is try to do this, the main enemy is the far right, and try to pin it on Farage. The difficult thing was that Farage had very deliberately not made clear what his political project was. So if you look at how the Brexit Party, I think we should have a conversation about the Brexit Party, its demographics. It's something which scares the shit out of me personally, is that it's notable how they stayed away from the issue of immigration.
I mean, also negative campaigns in general are shit. So, I mean, if your campaign is vote us to stop X, that's always a completely shit campaign. That was sort of like the Hillary Clinton campaign against Donald Trump. And they always fail. And they fail because people see it as lazy. If you say vote for us because the alternative's inherently worse, people can smell a rat. They can smell that you don't believe obviously they believe that you're against the far right. But, I mean, come on, you have to offer a little bit more than we're against those guys.
And it's something that we always say about the centrists is you not liking Jeremy Corbyn isn't enough.
Yeah. And you not liking Nigel Farage also isn't enough.
I thought the pitch by the Brexit Party over the last month was the most optimistic campaign we've seen since Jeremy Corbyn in 2017. And what people want, and I talked about this in the article, what people want is change and optimism and hope. And what I think enough Remainers don't understand is that is actually part of the allure of no deal for many people, right? Every successful anti-establishment left or right party, and I don't like to equate them because there's not much equivalence, but every successful party that's doing that right now, including Bernie Sanders, has a certain critique of globalisation. Now, the problem is when you decide to defend the European Union, you kind of forsake that. You give it up. And so it's very, very difficult to have an optimistic change campaign around staying in the European Union, which is why I think, generally speaking, even if Remain were to win a second referendum, which is possible, then I don't think they're going to win it by more than, say, 55%. So the best case scenario is you have a referendum which is viewed as illegitimate anyway, right? The idea it would be like 70-30 is for the birds. So I think, the optimism and the hope of the Brexit Party was really in complete contrast to UKIP and Tommy Robinson and the Nazi pug guy. And, that was reflected in the votes they got.
Tommy Robinson, 2.2% in the Northwest. So
didn't even keep his deposit.
Yeah, I know, that's fabulous, isn't it? Apparently he was... I think he stormed out of the results... what was it called? The results event or whatever it is after an hour. Looking
malicious.
Somewhat embarrassed. So a second referendum. You're coming round to it. This is the moment where everyone's laying their cards on the table. I mean, I've come round to it personally. Ultimately because I think... For tactical reasons, basically, I think that Labour are really going to struggle if they don't shift to that position. I mean, the Lib Dems getting 20%, that's a lot. And it does seem, so there was polls that came out last week. People got angry at me on Twitter about this, where it was saying, would you vote for Labour if they shifted position to a people's vote? And their polling went up 12%. And so what
for European elections?
For European elections.
Yeah.
No,
or for Westminster.
No, it was for European elections.
Exactly.
And what the People's Vote people were saying was sort of like, this means that Labour should back this position in these European elections and their vote would definitely go up. I mean, I interpret it slightly different, and I think Labour's strategists, given who they currently are, probably would as well, which is that people are actually quite forgiving. So it feels like the moment Labour pivot to that position, everyone might just come pouring back. And I think what that might do is mean that the Labour strategists kind of wait, unless they're faced with a coup, which I suppose is what's potentially happening now, unless it's completely forced on them.
I mean, So here's the thing about a second referendum, because I'm still, despite coming around to a second referendum, I'm a second referendum skeptic, because I think that persistently we substitute the mood and the political culture of London for the rest of the country. And that's a bias which is inbuilt at every single layer of politics and is, in particular reproduced by political media. And I say that as the most obnoxious London chauvinist in existence, that I can recognise that bias when I see it. And so I don't think that we can underestimate the strength of feeling for no deal that is out there. The problem with trying to maintain Labour's compromise position, and I think it was the responsible thing to do in 2016, 2017, it held together through 2018 but isn't working now, is because quite simply the Leave position over all that time has also been recalibrated. So before the first referendum actually happened, it's, people are talking about Norway. Dan Hannon saying no one's talking about leaving the single market. Like, what, are you crazy? Then after the referendum is won by Leave, the idea of Leave is a negotiated hard Brexit, and that's what is at stake. And so Labour takes quite wisely a soft Brexit position. That's the compromise, and that's then hardened even further towards a no-deal Brexit. And a no-deal Brexit, so lots of people talk about job losses, the hit to the economy and all the rest of it. The other thing which I think people don't get into is that's kind of like an impossible thing. I was talking to a friend of mine who was saying the problem with talking about no deal is no deal for how long? No deal for 10 days, no deal for 2 years. At some point, you've got to come back and negotiate a deal with the European Union, and this time in a much weaker economic position. It's an impossible thing, but it works because you don't have to explain it. And where Leave keeps moving, Labour's compromise position remaining static is a very difficult thing to do. It can't harden its Leave position. It simply won't be able to hold together its electoral coalition. I think lots of people would say that it's antithetical to Labour values of internationalism. And so then somewhat inevitably it has to look at second referendum moving towards more of a Remain and Reform or Remain or Revolt position. I don't know how you feel about that.
I actually think, I agree with you, but you said something very interesting a few weeks ago, and I think it's correct. Labour had a strategy along, but not really a position, right? And that's true. And I actually think in retrospect, if Labour pretty quickly after the 2016 referendum, and of course it's easy to say this now in 2019, if they'd said, you know what, we're going to go Norway plus, and we're going to have a referendum, and that's our position, it's agreed as a party, and we'll put that to a public vote. Initially you may have taken a hit, initially you may have had opportunists both sides, whatever, it may have kept UKIP a little bit more in the public eye, rather than them going into freefall. But they probably would be making gains from it now. Again, it's easy to say that, but we need to remember, where were we in 2016? There was a coup immediately following the referendum in 2016. The idea that Labour would have had a coherent, long-term, strategic idea about what they want to do was impossible anywhere until that September, by which point you're trying to... The politics of it necessarily was about alliance building and bridge building, because you just had a party leadership contest. So Labour, I think, could have done much better, but given the reality of the situation, that was never going to happen. But I agree with everything you said, actually. I think they probably have to have a second referendum now. They probably have to. I mean, but like you say, what's the alternative? No deal won't happen. There is no such thing as no deal. Even Dominic Raab is not saying no deal. He's saying potentially, WTO rules, or even Richard Tice, this Brexit Party guy, WTO rules, plus we will negotiate certain treaties with the EU ahead of leaving, which will cover a bunch of parts of the economy which they don't want to tank, because that's where they get funding and resources, and they have certain relations with the money interests, financial interests in this country. So yeah, it's a real problem, because no deal doesn't really exist. I mean, that's the beauty of things for Farage,
My strategic pitch, which I'll put out to see if you think is reasonable, and I think it solves some of your problems about Labour seeming, if they are to back a second referendum, as if they don't respect their Leave voters, is for Labour to come out and say, we back a second referendum now for the purposes of democracy, because we don't want this to be a parliamentary fudge that happens in sort of deals between MPs. And what we encourage the Tory party to do, given the Tories are in government, is elect a proper Leaver as a leader, Labour say we'll give them as much space as they want and need to arrange, either come to a hard Brexit deal with the EU or plan out very coherently what would be their no-deal strategy, so that no legislation would be, required that isn't known before the second referendum. And then a second referendum is the Tories' fully planned or fully ready to be legislated version of hard Brexit / managed no deal versus Labour's Remain. And then you say, this is proper Brexit, but properly explained Brexit, which can't be undone in Parliament because it's already pre-legislated for, versus Remain. Labour don't have to say, this is impossible if you choose this, the sky will fall in, the economy will collapse. Any legitimate, reasonable, rational person would vote for Remain. Labour can say, look, we recognise that both of these things have costs. We've made the judgment that remaining is much better, but also we completely understand why someone who might be a Labour voter and is welcome to continue being a Labour voter might vote for the Tories' hard Brexit deal. And then, people in the front bench can take their own positions. If Ian Lavery is campaigning for Brexit and John McDonnell's campaigning for Remain, I think that would be brilliant. That would demonstrate precisely what the message Labour want to get across, which is you can be a Leaver and a Labour supporter. You can be a Leaver and a supporting member of the Labour and a leading member of the Labour Party, But Labour as a whole is for Remain.
Can I just say one thing quickly? We saw, obviously, we'll probably talk about it in a bit, France and Italy. People saying, the far right didn't make the gains that were expected. Well, in 3 of the 4 largest economies in Europe, ultra-nationalist parties came first. In France, the Front National. In Italy, with Salvini. Of course, it's important to remember 5 years ago, the Partito Democratico, the centre-left party, finished first there. And, of course, the Brexit Party here. In Germany, the AfD fell back. The Greens came second. So if you look at the composition of the Front National in France in the European elections, where are they doing well? It's basically in small towns, it's in the countryside. And I think that London versus the rest of the country captures most of it because we have such a London dominance in this country, but it's basically big cities versus the rest of the country. So you saw Labour still coming first in Birmingham, Manchester, Leicester, Liverpool, obviously. And my worry is a lot of people are talking about we should be the party of the 52%. Which is fine, it might win you general elections. But if you look at the long-term collapse of the Parti Socialiste, the Communist Party in France, they gave up on basically half the country, which are now the stronghold of the Front National. And the question is, are you happy to have a long-term centre-left viable party if it means that basically they give a foothold to the far right in 20% of Britain? That's what happened in France.
So I've got a question for you. Brexit aside, what does a political settlement look like offered by Labour to those towns and rural areas that say, it's not going to be just metropolitan, socially progressive, but public institution, inclined, social workers. I'm trying to say social workers.
I'm not sure what you're trying to say.
When you lose, I was trying to say people who have an emotional attachment to the public sector.
Public sector workers.
Yeah, but not necessarily who work in the public sector themselves.
Okay.
Does that make sense? That didn't make.
But people in towns value the public sector as well, No,
but I was saying that
there's a higher proportion actually of public sector workers in places outside the big cities.
As well as being socially progressive, have a sort of almost like patrician attachment to the public sector.
There is something of an there is something of an answer, which is Preston.
There's a question for Aaron anyway.
Yeah, there's something of an answer, which is Preston. In Preston, Labour finished first. They finished above the Brexit Party. If you look at towns of that size in that part of the world, that wasn't really happening. And so the outlier is Preston, where there is a local vision for municipal socialism. And so there is a really good counter-argument to say, actually, if Labour was arguing for this stuff at the local level with really strong local presences, actually you can stem the far right, whatever happens with regards to Brexit, right? Whether you'll leave or remain. I personally think half the reason why Preston Labour did so well is because of Labour's position. No journalist wants to talk about that because they want to talk about how terrible it is. Clearly it's worked in some places. It's not worked in most places, but it's clearly worked in some places. Someone like Leicester voted leave. Birmingham voted leave. They came first. So clearly it's worked in some places. So I think there is an answer, which is, it's municipal socialism. Do I think Jeremy Corbyn's capable of delivering that? Yes. Do I think John McDonnell's capable of delivering that? Yes. How many people in the Parliamentary Labour Party, how much institutional power in the Labour movement is capable of delivering that? Questionable. Really, let's be real. How many MPs are capable of delivering that agenda? Do they have the politics, the gravitas, the belief, the confidence, the ideas to actually win over the kinds of places we're talking about with a radical economic agenda. I don't think that there are actually there's maybe 20, 30 MPs in the Labour Party who really take that question seriously. Maybe more. Okay, let's say it's 100. And that's really worrying for me. It's really concerning.
Ash, hold that thought 1 second. We have 1,350 people watching right now. As you will know, this is not our usual scheduled show. This is an emergency show. This is one of the things whenever I'm asking for your support, I tell you we can do more of with more of your cash donations. So as you know, this show is only possible because of your kind donations. If you already donate, thank you very much. If you don't, please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. As well as this being an emergency Tysky, you might also notice that the quality is really nice tonight. I've been looking at it on my laptop. Gary has got a new bit of kit, which means that when we move quickly, it doesn't sort of like leave a shadow or a wave.
There was always a frame.
Much crisper.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, so crisp.
How much was that?
I don't know. How much was that, Gary?
250 quid. Wow.
250 quid.
Also, Aaron, on the municipal socialism point, Leicester voted Remain by a narrow margin, 51%.
Oh, okay. My apologies. Okay, well, I get confused. Birmingham voted Leave, right?
Let me check.
I think Birmingham voted Leave. But Leicester's obviously one of the most diverse cities in the country, and it was like 50-50, basically.
All right, while you're checking, the thing I forgot to say, which I always say as well, like this video. It means it appears in more people's newsfeed. Share it on Facebook. Share it on Twitter.
Brexit by a whisker.
Yeah.
Fabulous. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take a couple of questions in the middle of the show.
Is Ash not going to...
Oh, yeah, you had a point before that, though.
I said that, didn't I?
Or was it to correct?
I can't remember what it is now. I think maybe I wanted
Parliamentary Labour Party. Have they got the personnel?
Oh, yeah, but this is also the point that you're making, which is we should think about a second referendum as also coming with demands in terms of what the left wants for, party democracy. One thing being open selections, because a second referendum, it's only a stick with which to beat Corbyn if you let it be one. If you have, I think, demands attached. Well, no.
Every tool is a weapon if you hold it right.
Ooh.
What do you see as going on in the Labour Party right now? So a lot of people in the comments are getting, they're saying these strategy questions are somewhat besides the point while Tom Watson is still in place, and sort of you can read all of these arguments about Brexit ultimately as a campaign to get rid of Corbyn. And I don't know what you think is the actual strategy going on in the Labour Party, because I mean what it looks like and what people are explicitly saying is I think that the PLP are basically going to threaten a kind of all-out rebellion unless there's either a significant change in strategy or, I mean, it seems like some people want scalps in terms of personnel. I don't think people are seriously suggesting getting rid of Corbyn, but they're going for some of his key advisors. Yeah. Ash?
So I think that the problem has been one of indecision. And I think that the internal political conflict particularly around Corbyn has been a principled one. So I don't think that it's been one of sort of, being ideologically wedded to Alexit or anything like that. I think for the most part, the people surrounding Corbyn are pragmatists. I think that the internal struggle has been one over democratic legitimacy. Is it legitimate to not implement the result of a first referendum simply because it is difficult? Is it democratically legitimate to say we will prioritise one set of our voters over another? And I think that that real moral wrestling has led to the kind of paralysis that we've seen, particularly in recent months. Jeremy Corbyn himself has not appeared to be particularly dynamic when responding to issues of Brexit. When it comes to PMQs, he always leads on issues around social policy and funding. Very, very, very rarely Brexit. And that has gone from being you're the man who speaks on the real issues which affect people in this country and that people really care about, to looking evasive. And I think it has been evasive. It's been a sort of demonstration of the unwillingness to face up to the decision facing the leader's office. So I think the problem's primarily one of indecision. For that, I don't want to see scalps. I don't want to see scalps. I don't want to see scalps also because I think that would mean cutting off some quite crucial aspects of Corbynism. Lots of people have been talking about Seamus Milne. I think that actually when it comes to the anti-imperialism of the Corbyn project, which for me is integral component to the policy vision. He's been an anchor for that. I wouldn't want to see that gone. I think, if, the person who was directly in charge of running this EU elections campaign, perhaps running national election campaigns for the Labour Party, is not for them. But I don't think that head should roll merely for the sake of it.
What do you make of Paul Mason's article today, where he says he actually says this? I mean, anybody who says the word anti-imperialism shouldn't really be anywhere near the Labour leadership, or I guess in terms of message management in front of a camera.
I disagree intensely with that, but you know that Paul and I have differences on foreign policy, the military, and historically immigration, although I think that some of his viewpoints have changed on this. There are multiple kinds of anti-imperialism, right? So there's George Galloway anti-imperialism, which isn't anti-imperialism in general. It's anti-American imperialism of a particular kind, of the neoconservative kind.
It's very popular, actually, amongst even Tory voters.
Bannon culture wars, that's fine. But, anti-neocon American imperialism, but also not particularly pro-human rights. Yep. He's not someone who is interested in the democratization of power, either at the level of party politics or indeed that of geopolitics, I think, in any meaningful sense. Those kinds of anti-imperialists who essentially are not politically curious in any sense. Of course, they shouldn't be near a camera. But the anti-imperialism that says, hang on, Britain has a historic responsibility towards those countries that it formerly colonized. Actually, socialism can't just take place in one country. It's about looking at wealth disparities on a global level, looking at how production works on a global level. Of course, those anti-imperialists should be in front of a camera, because lots of people feel very passionately about those ideas, and it also puts water between this iteration of the Labour project and the one that came immediately before, that of New Labour.
I just think the stuff he was saying about how they need to win over right-wing voters by, being Remain, but now talking about drugs and police and gangs. I was like, wow, okay. Do you know what I mean? I found, if anything, that's a more regressive discourse than like saying, yeah, we're okay with you voting Leave. Because Leave is often a dog whistle for those other things, for social conservatism. It's almost like he was like, let's just go back to the social conservatism.
But those ideas aren't new from Paul Mason. I mean, me and him have talked at length about issues and perceptions around security, safety, in particular the nuclear deterrent. This has been a sort of consistent thread in his thinking. Now he's positioning it as a trade-off, and it's something which speaks to the political and social vision of Leave voting constituencies. I think it's probably homogenises those Leave voting constituencies, and it's a kind of patrician response of like, you wanted Brexit, but we'll give you a nuclear bomb instead. Should be fine.
But the drugs thing was bizarre, because the people that take the most drugs in this country are like white working class people in towns. Like, they're the people that may take the most drugs.
I mean, I don't know who takes the most drugs.
Statistically, it's true. No, statistically, it's true. I mean, I remember seeing data around that, but okay. I mean, you can question it, but statistically, it's
I mean, I think there's an
idea
element
that they're all like, we don't do drugs with teetotal. We're all going down the pub 11 o'clock. We only drink alcohol. We don't. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. Nobody's talking about banning drugs. Nobody's talking about that. I don't know where he's got that from.
I actually think you need to get the wavy vote out.
I'm not sure about those particular examples. I think Labour should be making quite a strong case for drug decriminalisation, for example. But I do think
to be clear, he's talking about the opposite, right?
Yeah, no, I know that. But I think the place he's coming from can be somewhat more nuanced than people on Twitter can suggest.
That's true.
And I think that is in not saying we will say whatever the quote-unquote white working class want or whatever that might be, but saying potentially if we're out of step with this many people in the public, we should consider that maybe our dogmas were somewhat incorrect. And you often find this with people who stand for local government. So now that lots of people from the left have become councillors or are standing for MPs, they find out that actually when you knock on people's doors and you ask them what are their major concerns, they say, oh, well, I'm a bit worried about crime in the area. I'm a bit worried about XYZ. I'm worried that the lights don't get fixed. Sort of things that the left in an abstract way would often call sort of like law and order concerns that are somewhat regressive, that when you actually speak to actual people, which is what you have to do when it comes to electoral politics, you realise that maybe you were somewhat dogmatic in the first place.
Councils don't build prisons and stuff like that, right? He's talking about national policy. Obviously, councillors should be trying to, enforce the rule of law, trying to stop antisocial behaviour. If somebody does something bad, helping the victim, etc. Of course, but that's not what Paul's saying. Paul's talking about a macroeconomic policy, top-down policy, state-led policy around things like prisons, drugs, policing, the military. I agree with you. Ultra-leftists on Twitter go OTT with it, but it's still quite frightening. It's still quite frightening to me because the sorts of people he's trying to reach out to, social conservative, historically UKIP, now Brexit Party voters, they want some quite bad things. I'd quite like to change their mind on those things through an economic agenda, which he now seems to be writing off. He was saying the opposite several years ago, right? He was saying you can buy those people in with an economic agenda. He's now saying something quite different.
You know what we should do? We should stop talking about Paul Mason's article because we should get him on soon. He's a friend of the show, and do a whole full-hour show on social conservatism and the left. I think it will be very good. Law and order, social conservatism and the left.
Oh my God, can we do like a Law and Order theme as in like the crime show Law and Order?
Yeah, exactly. We'll have the Bill theme tune and that kind of thing.
For like the scene change, like the da-da.
Don't give away all the gimmicks that we'll have on this show. I'm going to take some of your questions because I said I would. I've been collecting them. Joe Morris asks, if there's a Labour leadership challenge, could enough left candidate come about? What if John McDonnell put himself forward?
I don't think John McDonnell would necessarily put himself forward. I think that Corbyn would win another leadership challenge quite handily. The issue for me would be these things that we can't measure through statistics. One of those things is just sort of mood, optimism, the emotional affect undergirding the whole project. I think lots of the membership are tired of their main mobilisation either being to do with an internal leadership contest or forms of glorified door knocking. The sort of internal project of party democracy has stalled. Momentum's been doing great work in terms of trying to engage people on a policy level and give them really meaty things to do and engage with, but the party hasn't done those things. What worries me about a leadership election is that Corbyn will win, but people will lose faith in his ability to engage them in a meaningful and empowered political way. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, almost the simpler answer is that he's not going anywhere. I mean, it's almost a moot point. I don't think anyone's suggesting getting rid of Corbyn at this point.
There might be we don't know, there might be a stalking horse from the right. I don't think they have the numbers. John McDonnell certainly isn't going to challenge him. John McDonnell wouldn't want to be the leader of the Labour Party. But just quickly, I think the problem with Jeremy Corbyn really since 2017 is political management. He and the people around him, and this is a problem if you think about it for when Labour is in government, are very bad at political... I'm not being like, I'm great at it. It's very difficult, right? Tony Blair was good at political management, and that project fell apart after like 3 or 4 years, right? They're not so great at political management. They're very good at being insurgents. They're very good at trying to attack and establish common sense. Now, they've won it. They've prevailed in Labour for years. And I think it's particularly with Brexit, you see that sort of genre of political management show that they're not really made for that politics. Now, I would say if there was a leadership election, I think, if anything, it might energise the party. And the best thing that ever happened to Jeremy Corbyn was the 2016 leadership election. We would not have got the result we did in 2017 without it. I'm not saying that would be repeated, but if you got a Blairite running against him and somehow they got the nominations, you could have a very high energy campaign. And one of my biggest concerns with the project around Jeremy Corbyn is that they never take decisive, compelling action unless they absolutely have to. And the 2 times they've had to were 2015 leadership election and the 2016 leadership election, and of course the 2017 general election, so 3 times. They had to. There was a necessity there to be really risk-taking, to really go for it. And unless they have to, they don't tend to do that. And the problem is right now, with what we saw last night, they have to do that. And to a lesser extent with the local elections, right? Why isn't the Preston model on the lips of everybody in this country? It should be the template for how you do local government in Britain, but nobody's talking about it. Why? And again, it's because there's no big sort of dynamic, optimistic thinking. That they only seem to do that when their back is against the wall, which is better than never at all. But, you wonder how long can a project last where that's the norm.
I mean, also they do need They do need a better answer on Brexit. I mean, I think because one thing that's held them up is it's difficult to bring up those exciting things that they like to talk about whilst this is the major issue in politics.
I mean, here's the thing about a second referendum, and this is from a purely cynical point of view, which is that it externalizes decision making. So rather than saying that Brexit is a contradiction which has to be handled within the party, where decisions have to be made within the party, it's saying, you know what, we didn't choose this shit.
Yeah.
Electorate, this is up to you. And what we're going to do is find the policy agenda that we want to implement. And here's the thing, is that I think that the lack of focus on municipal governance and the sort of saturation of the Brexit issue are intimately entwined. One of the things that 2016 illustrated very well is that there is actually a crisis of democracy in this country, and a crisis of democratic distance between yourself and sovereign decision-making institutions. There is a sense that your council doesn't care or can't help, that your constituency MP maybe knocks on your door once every 4 or 5 years, thank you very much, goodbye. And then when it comes to Westminster, when it comes to your your regional government, when it comes to the European Parliament, these things are so far away and so arcane and so up here that there's no meaningful way for you to have your voice or your will even acknowledged. And then what the Brexit referendum did was saying, here is the sort of avenue for you to articulate how you feel. And it was the only avenue at that time. It was, I think, supremely powerful for letting people say, like, we don't feel that we've got control over the institutions which dictate our lives. Whether or not we leave or remain, those problems exist, and it is things like the Preston model, which I think are poised to resolve them in a meaningful way. Perhaps, I always thought the idea of an English parliament was like just racists wanted it, but maybe we do actually have to look at devolution of powers with regards to England as a meaningful political unit, and we have to sort of navigate or find a way to transfer the emotional energy that we pour into Brexit, and Brexit as a sort of conflict over values and political culture rather than institutional arrangements, into more immediate and more present sovereign decision-making bodies.
A completely new question. Jack Isaac. The Green Party aren't often talked about on the show. Their policies are largely to the left of Corbyn's Labour. What is the Navarro take on their message and whether they can contribute in a positive way? I suppose some context here is they scored 12.1%, so an excellent result for the Greens last Thursday, finishing above the Conservatives. So they are definitely, they warrant a conversation. No, I have invited some Green politicians on, and they keep either flaking or not replying. So if you are a leading Green politician, you are invited onto a
we
future
weren't that integral to their electoral strategy.
I don't know, why not? I mean,
they don't need us, right?
Well, I suppose so. I mean, maybe that's telling.
Maybe they were like, you're not going to help.
Because they're
not going for the left of Labour, are they? They're going for the sort of slightly less left-wing Liberal vote, even though they are, some of their economic policies are potentially to the left of Labour.
The thing is, the Greens sound great, and I know some great Greens. Adam Ramsey, I think, wrote their 2014 European Manifesto, or maybe even their manifesto for the general election in 2015. Lots of that stuff found its way into the Labour Manifesto, 2017. But there was an MEP recently, and she said, Labour chose the wrong leader in Corbyn. They should have gone for Yvette Cooper. And it's really important to say that the Green Party is not an eco-socialist party. It may seem that way because Caroline Lucas is great and Sian Berry is great. Actually, Jonathan Bartley seems pretty cool. I don't really know much about him, but he seems pretty good. You got that new guy, is it Majid?
Majid.
So some of these high-profile people, they look and sound great, but some of their older activists are what we call deep Greens, which is to say, fundamentally, they care more about. It sounds cliche and being horrible, but they care more about jute bags rather than social justice and economic disadvantage. And for eco-socialists, these two things are mutually constitutive. There's a lot of people in the Green Party that don't think like that. And one thing's really important. I was briefly in the Green Party, and I went to a meeting. Where did I go to a meeting? It was somewhere in London. I can't remember where. Somewhere in East London. And I went to the meeting, and it was all white people. And this is in the middle of London. And it was supremely strange. And I went to Labour Party meetings in central London. It was incredibly reflective of the general public. And this is really, really, really important to emphasise. When you go, people find it very hard to believe sometimes. When you actually go to organised Labour events, when you go to Labour Party events, COEs, not always, but a lot of the time, people are kind of shocked at how reflective they are of society.
I was shocked.
He's not so sure, but
I mean, I used to live in a very BAME part of London, and the CLP was very, very white. So I mean,
I guess
I wasn't particularly impressed by the reflectiveness of that
my
meeting.
first Labour Party conference, which was Brighton 2017, and I'd always, like, Aaron had always been saying, like, Ash, you should come to, like, a Labour thing, just check it out. And I was like, no, I don't want to be around that many white people, unless it's a yoga class, in which case that's fine. And I was delighted by what I saw, and also seeing BAME people in positions of institutional power, organisational power was fantastic. Just on the Greens thing, anecdote, lots of people who I've been talking to over the last few days told me that their kids voted Green. So people of my age and younger voting Green, not because of the Brexit stance, but because they feel that climate change is an existential threat. Labour's doing some fantastic work on that, and really should be applauded for how far it's moved in such a short space of time, but needs to go so much further. And that's the thing, is that there are still these conflicts within the Labour left in terms of how you decarbonise, how you manage a just transition into a decarbonised economy. And there's, I think, some issues around that sort of social conservatism which we'd picked up that is also around climate justice issues.
Yeah. And also, I mean, you have to understand, if you're watching this and you're young and you're on the left and you're sort of quite ambivalent about Labour or the socialists' argument around sort of climate justice, ecological issues, there is absolutely no chance in hell we're going to decarbonise this country's economy, or indeed any other country's economy, without the involvement of the Labour movement. Right, and the historical issue that people had with the Greens and why they defended the Labour Party, something like an Owen Jones, even through the darkest days, and I used to laugh at them for saying it, was there's this link with the Labour movement. It's pretty big. It's about 6.5 million people, and it's not great. It's great. It's not perfect, but it's more reflective of everyday Britain than any other civil society act we've got, and it's been 200 years in the making. And like I say, the idea that you're going to remake our economy in the absence of that is very, very, very hard. Which is why I think the only reason, the only vote really to have a green economy is to vote for Labour, and the only meaningful socialism in the 21st century is eco-socialism.
Anyway, just as we did with Paul Mason, the Greens aren't here. We'll try and get them on, and we'll do a whole show about what the point of the Greens are and whether you should vote Green. Someone's asked a somewhat unfair question, which is, has there ever been a working class Green MP? The answer is no, but there has only been one Green MP. So,
Can I also
make of that what you will.
For context, not many people are talking about this. The Greens, I think, did better in 1989 than they did yesterday. In the European elections then. So this has happened before, right?
Completely new topic. Niall Glynn, question. Do you think we should be paying more attention to the 63% who didn't vote? Surely these would be largely leavers. Can't really see Remainers not voting last week. I mean, firstly, statistically, a lot of Remainers didn't vote last week. I think an interesting question is, for me, it seems logically the people who were least likely to turn out are people who don't really care about Brexit, which is potentially why the results could make the country look more polarised than it is. Because I think there was a clear vote. Like, if you were a Leaver, there was a party for you. There was the Brexit Party. It was a very successful campaign, and I think they were incredibly successful at mobilising people who were passionate about Leave. The Greens and the Lib Dems did okay at mobilising people who were passionate about Remain. So I'd have thought it would be people who were more in the middle who stayed at home, which is why potentially Labour or the Conservatives might take or try and cling on to some hope by that fact that maybe there are people who won't compromise, but they just didn't bother to turn out.
I mean, I think in terms of turnout for European elections, this is a historically all right one. It's not an election which most people feel particularly passionate about. The campaigning is very different. The sort of broadcast permeation of issues that are, European voting issues. It's poor coverage unless it's literally the week before. It's kind of like local elections. I mean, people just don't feel that strongly about it in the same way they do for a general election. I just don't think it's that deep.
No, I agree, but that's also a really bad thing. Because if you look at, say, like Obama, I've talked about this before. Obama wins 2008, 2012, and it looks like over 8 years, America's transforming. At a local level, the Democrats get completely hollowed out because everybody's like, oh yeah, look, this brown charismatic guy is at the top of the country, things must be okay. And then when Trump wins, it's not just Trump winning, you also get control of the House. You have lawmakers across the US who are fundamentally right-wing. So I think in the absence of that sort of local politics, Corbynism really won't change actually that much, which is why, you know, we need to engage in that broader cultural shift, telling people, to be honest, actually, I don't think these elections mattered that much, right? But local elections really, really matter. When you go to a town or city, like at the moment I'm living in Portsmouth, Portsmouth is appallingly run. There's loads of stuff that's just really bad. And places like London are run really well. Partly, yeah, it's because there's more investment, but partly it's because you just have really talented, enterprising people that tend to be in the Labour Party, who are running really smart councils. Some of them are quite bad, you know, some bad stuff happening in Southwark. I saw Claudia Webb tweeting about some of the stuff they're doing in Old Street in Hackney around cycling provision. It's amazing. You don't get that level of sort of thoughtfulness and innovation often beyond London. We need to change that. We need great people in local government across the country.
All right, next question. Juliet Jakes, friend of the show. A second referendum is fraught with logistical and constitutional problems. Should Corbyn put the burden of responsibility to address them on the People's Vote campaigners?
Here's the thing, is that the People's Vote campaigners, the office itself is sort of split. So you've got the front of house run by Blairites who nobody likes but know how to win things, and the sort of back of house run by Milibandites who nobody likes but don't know how to win things. And between those two things, I really don't have a great deal of faith in them running an effective second referendum campaign. Because when you think about the messaging that they've consistently put out, one, for the last 3 years they've been attacking the wrong people. So there was that massive billboard of John McDonnell in Jacob Rees-Mogg's pocket, and I just sort of thought,
was it John McDonnell, not Jeremy Corbyn?
No, it was John McDonnell.
Oh, because it was in his constituency, wasn't it?
Yeah. I was just kind of like, you dunderheads. They had very little interest in winning over Tory waverers. They sort of had their weekly lunch meeting with Justine Greening or whatever it is, and then called it a day, but didn't make any real effort to permeate the party of government. So that sort of showed me what their interest was, and it was turning the progressive alliance between Social Democrats and the left in on itself, and making that very hostile. The second thing which shows me that they're not very serious is that the majority of arguments which come out of the People's Vote campaign aren't arguments in favour of a second referendum. They're arguments against having had the first one. And that for me is just complete and utter bollocks. Unless you're going to be serious about this and build a time machine, shut the fuck up and talk about the Brexit option that's on the table and why people need to make a decision about it. Don't relitigate 2016. And then the third thing that tells me that they're not particularly serious people is that they're very happy for the architects of what I think one of the biggest betrayals of political trust ever to happen in this country, the Iraq War, front and centre of their campaign. So suddenly Alistair Campbell, because he wears a hoodie nowadays, that means that he's changed and he didn't tell lies which resulted in the deaths of 1 million Iraqis. You've got Tony Blair with an increasingly leathery face and squinty eye marching up and down the Sunday politics shows saying why we should trust him. And one of the lines of the People's Vote document which got leaked on Sunday night that really galled me was this appeal to Labour Party democracy that never again would the membership allow the leadership to take the party into a disastrous decision. So these are the architects of the Iraq War saying that we won't do another Iraq, which is leaving the European Union, and that the same people who've been against party democracy invoking it as a principle to adopt a more Remain position. Now, I voted Remain 2016. I would again. Would I go near a campaign run by these jokers, clowns and cynics? Fuck no, man.
I think I interpreted the question slightly differently, which is
Sorry.
about the... No, I think that's a very good answer. But just to address that as well, because I think the way it was about the logistical problems of the second referendum, I'm presuming that Juliet Jakes thinks that there are significant logistical problems of a second referendum that undermine the ability to have it. For example, what's on the question or what's on the question paper, etc., etc. And I think in that in that respect, standing back and saying, "Oh, we'll let the people's vote work it out," doesn't. We need if you want to be a party of government, you have to have a position on the most important question that's facing the country at the moment. So I think if Labour had been arguing for the last 2 years that we won't have a people's vote because the first referendum should be respected or because it's logistically impossible, that would have been a legitimate position. But because they haven't been doing that, because they've been saying, well, maybe we'll have a people's vote. If you've said maybe we'll have a people's vote, I think you have a responsibility to sort of set out how that would happen and what it would look like.
But don't you think, I mean, that's one of the most annoying things for me, is that people who have tried to edge Labour closer to a second referendum position for years are now saying that their position is ambiguous. Yeah, no shit. That's a direct consequence of what you've been trying to do, right? And
no, I don't think that's... the reason it's ambiguous is because the party is split. Because
no, but there are people quite overtly, and that's their right. They're saying, look, Labour is edging close. They write about it in op-eds and articles and so on, and they say Labour is edging closer to where we want them to go to. And then in the same breath, they'll say, well, their position is ambiguous. They're being punished for it. You know, Labour had a crystal clear position in 2017. They did, and that's why I think they did very, very well. Now, I know a lot of Remainers, not as many as Paul's saying in his article. He said the reason why Labour did so well was Remainers, but there clearly were Remainers who voted for Labour, and they said, you know what, they'll probably sort it out. I think we'll probably even... There was clearly an element of that, but I think that the clarity of Labour's line in 2017, if they could reproduce that and emulate it somehow now, I think that would really serve them well.
I mean, their 2017 line basically was, we won't have a second referendum because you can't override a referendum before you've fulfilled its result. So I suppose in a way you can say it was the campaigners that made them lose that. But ultimately, I think if the Labour Party has changed its position, it should explain why. And what it's done is it hasn't explained why it's not why it's not 100% for a people's vote, and it hasn't explained. Do you know what I mean? I think what the Labour Party should have said is, we're not going to have a people's vote. Sorry, we know a lot of our members and a lot of our supporters want it, but the reason we're not going to do it is this. And instead what they've said is, we might do. And the reason they've said, we might do, is because they think that can keep as many people on side as possible. If they were honest about the reason they don't want one, then they think people would go to the Lib Dems.
I think this is also a problem of some of Labour's messaging, which is, I think that, like I said, the strategy after 2016 was the right one for 2 years, and I think it's starting to fall apart now, is that as it's been falling apart, you've seen various Labour frontbenchers take to the media when faced with this, your position is ambiguous, people don't understand it, going, no, it is not, it's kind of your fault that you don't understand it. And to me, I was just like, every time I see that, I'm like, oh god, like, you can't put the blame on the electorate for not swinging behind your position, because that's either a problem in your messaging or the position that you've taken itself. And I think the more honest thing to say would be like, yeah, you know what, it is fucking frustrating, because what we're trying to do is bring together two sides who really don't want to be brought together. So no wonder you're pissed off at us all the time, but ultimately we think that doing this will have these effects and they're more positive. I never heard the argument get put across in that way. I'd never heard anyone apart from like us lot talk about the difference between position and strategy. I'd never heard anyone talk about frustration as though that is a legitimate feeling to have because you're trying to achieve something bigger. All I heard from frontbenchers was almost like, you're wrong for feeling frustrated. And I thought that was an error.
Well, there's just not many good MPs. I mean, that's the problem, right? There's not many good left-wing MPs who can do that. The majority of Labour MPs would happily castigate Labour even if they had the right position on something. In this instance, it turns out they had the wrong one. So, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to do. And when you reflect on the sort of the triumph of Corbyn really after the sort of 2017 general election, he could have done anything he wanted. And I do think there'll be some major regrets over the next few years about there not being more decisive action and ensuring party coherence, not just around policy, but also personnel. I think that would be regretted because in politics you have to be ruthless, and Labour hasn't been. And I've always said I think the biggest weakness for Jeremy Corbyn is that he's too nice. And there is an absence of ruthlessness. And I'm not talking about, not ruthlessness when you're under the cosh, like now, but when you're doing well and you're flying, that's when you actually need to make some really tough decisions. And that didn't happen. I remember before the coup in 2016, talking to certain people, they're not working there now, but talking to certain people near that world and saying there's going to be a coup. And they're like, no, don't be silly. And of course there was one, the following week. And, I said after 2017, we need to get mandatory selection. No, they'll all fall in line. And then, this is a permanent state of sort of civil war within the Labour Party. There is a sort of element of wishful thinking in not taking political challenges head on.
But I agree with your mandatory reselection. I'm quite glad that Corbyn's approach to leadership hasn't been that sort of, Tony Blair, any decision that's important is going to take place in my office with a selected handful, various whips grabbing dissident MPs by the bollocks and stuff in the halls of Parliament. I'm really glad the culture's
No, I don't mean for votes, but there isn't a culture of democracy in the Labour Party, and and they have to ensure that's happening, but it's not happening.
And so for me, that's about mobilisation of the membership and empowerment of the membership on policy issues. I think that will ultimately strengthen Corbyn's position, but then we also need to be okay with the membership taking positions which are antagonistic to the leadership. And I'm not just talking about Brexit here. I'm talking about the need to decarbonise quicker than the leadership thinks is possible, for instance.
Can I just respond to this quickly? Every time, there are people up and down this country, we just want to say in Worthing for local elections, Labour in East Worthing and Shoreham didn't have a single councillor for 47 years. They won the first councillor there in 2017. They now have 10 councillors. Those people, it's primarily women there. Also, first Muslim councillor was voted onto the council this month. Those people are working incredibly hard, right? They're knocking on doors, they're talking to people, they're having 100 conversations a week, and they're working really hard to change people's minds. And every time a leading, quote, Labour figure goes on the television and undermines the party's position on something, it undoes tens of hours of their work. And I just think, quite frankly, that's an insult to them. That's an insult to the little people in the party. And I do take that as a problem, and I do think the leadership should do something about it. And where I think they should impose discipline on those people is not to say you shouldn't do that, but it should be, look, you are fundamentally screwing over the people that have put us where we are, right? And if you believe in party democracy, please toe the line. If you're going to be critical, at least initially do it in private. The sort of reflex should not be public ostracism of the left, or, and I just don't think that's that much to ask.
Yeah, but huge sections of the PLP don't like party democracy. I think all of us sort of share this analysis, and that's sort of reflected in this uncertain position of what are CLPs for? What's the point of going to your CLP meeting? What's the point in participating in these discussions of policy? What's the likelihood of that making its way up the food chain, if you will, and affecting the direction of the party in general? And so I think that's the thing, is that it's not just about how do you have processes of selection which make MPs in the parliamentary party more respectful towards their constituency parties. I think it's also about having more formal mechanisms for ideas to travel up.
All right, we've done an hour, so let's do a final question before we get off, and it's a good one because it sort of sets our mind on what's coming up. This is from Eduardo Perez. All a no-deal Prime Minister has to do in order to get a no-deal is not ask for an extension. The only way Parliament can stop a no-deal is a no-confidence vote. Correct?
That is correct, and it would take about 20 Tory MPs to revolt. Although the interesting question is, would Change UK no confidence the Tories? Because on the one hand, they say they want to stop Brexit, but obviously a general election would wipe them out. They've just got, I think, 4%, 2%, maybe 3%, I can't remember, in these elections. So you would need about 20, 25 Tories to no confidence the Tory government. Never happened before. Until very recently, I would have said it's impossible. But then, they're at 9% in a national election, their lowest. People are saying since 1832, we didn't have democracy in 1832. That was the Great Reform Act. That's basically the beginning of the modern parliamentary system. They're never going to get a lower percentage of that in any national election, probably ever again, because the reason being, they'll break up before that happens. So possible. It needs about 20, 25 Tories.
Ash, any thoughts on that?
It all depends who becomes Tory party leader. And I think we've spent a lot of time talking about Labour, rightly, because that's what we do and it's what we do very well. But one of the things that we can't forget is the depth and profundity of the crisis in the Conservative Party right now. Now, the One Nation Conservatives who see themselves as Tory moderates, who want a compromise position on Brexit, who are instinctive Remainers, they will try and keep Boris Johnson off the membership vote, because there are two stages in the Tory leadership election. There's the parliamentary party vote, which is sort of weird battle royale with people getting knocked off incrementally until only 2 are standing. And if Boris is one of those final 2, he will absolutely walk the membership vote. I don't know if any of you out there have put like a cheeky 10 quid on Rory Stewart because, babe, it's not happening. You may as well flush it down the toilet. Boris is getting it. And he is loathed and reviled within the parliamentary party. I think if he did get it, and I think he's also, perhaps we differ on how he'll be in power. I think there are some people who feel he'll soften his Brexit stance. I personally think that he'll go for the most reckless option possible, because he's always been a man who plays to the gallery on these things. That's when you could, I think, perhaps see rebellion against a Johnson-led government.
But here's the thing. Again, I would agree with you, but you have to look at what's happening. So there was a poll recently, which I think basically, if there was a general election on that day, the Tories would get 120 MPs. Now, if the Brexit Party is polling really well, which it will be, right? If the Tories don't deliver Brexit by October 31st, or if they're really sort of flaking towards the autumn, Brexit Party will be flying. I can see it leading in national Westminster polls. That's not to say they'll be the largest party in Parliament, but they'll be doing very, very well. If the Tories then call a general election, the reality is MPs will know they're all going to lose their seats, right? And it's very difficult to imagine. Fundamentally, these people just want to keep their jobs. It's very difficult to imagine Tories choosing to lose their job, which is the honourable thing, to stop no deal. So, I mean, but at the same time, obviously, no deal is crazy. So when people say no deal can't happen, it's impossible, which I've said as well, I just think we are getting to a sort of perfect storm where it is plausible. If the Tory party think they're only going to win 130 seats in a Westminster election, maybe a lot of backbenchers will go with it. I think ultimately you probably would get 20 Tories who would stop that happening. But I don't think it would be a deluge of people, because I agree with you. In normal circumstances, yeah, a lot of them would just want to put egg on his face, get Corbyn in for a little bit, he'll sort it, they'll, have the electoral consequences. We'll be back in a couple of years. They know that won't happen this time.
I think this is the most interesting question in British politics right now, and it relates actually back to last week's show when John Curtis was on, and he was saying Sir John Curtis, and he was saying when he talks to business leaders, he's sort of finds it funny having this conversation about the fact that potentially a Corbyn government would be more in their interests than a hard Brexiteer Tory-led government. And I think if you've got someone like Boris walking Britain to the edge of a cliff when it comes to no deal, basically because he's more interested in the Conservative Party than he is in the economy. He doesn't really sort of dance to the tune of Britain's business interests. He just dances to the tune of himself, right? Fuck business, exactly. But I think you've definitely got more than 25 Tory MPs who are more interested in what business thinks than what is good for the Conservative Party. Ultimately, because if they lose their seats, they can go work in the city if they want to. So I think if there were a Tory leader that was going to take us right to the edge of a catastrophic no deal Brexit, you probably would get a vote of no confidence in that Prime Minister, which actually interestingly is the point at which you might see a people's vote come on the table if the Tories would prefer that to a general election.
Andrew Neil saying that he thinks that a second referendum more likely than a general election at this stage. But on John Curtis saying that Corbyn's policies are a lot less radical than people think. Today I tweeted quite flippantly about capital controls, just as an example of the means by which government can break the rules of the EU but stay inside the EU, because Cyprus imposed capital controls, Greece imposed capital controls. I'm not saying pro-capital controls. And Ian Martin and a bunch of other sort of Tory Twitter personalities were like, see, business leaders, this is what they want to do. And I was like, fam, I don't think John McDonnell is taking economics policy advice from someone who did English lit at uni and dropped maths after GCSE. Like, fuck me. Just something that I thought was very funny is that it seems to me that simply because the right doesn't have anyone generating economic ideas for them, that they seem to think that anyone can generate economic ideas for the left. Trust me, the entrance criteria a lot higher than one GCSE.
If Jacob Rees-Mogg can write a history of the Victorians, I mean, you can write economic policy for the Labour Party, right?
Oh, fuck me.
You're probably better qualified to do that than Rees-Mogg is.
It's getting really trashed, that book, isn't it? Maybe we should do a review show.
Maybe we should try and interview him. That'd be great.
Anyway,
right,
thank you both for joining me this evening. You're going to leave even before I end the show.
Yeah, sure.
It's only going to be like another 30 seconds. I'm going to do this really quickly, apparently. Thank you for watching TyskySour. Thank you for watching Navarra Media. As you know, this show is only possible because of your kind support, especially these emergency type shows. We're going to be doing more of these in the coming weeks and months. As you know, you get a notification for them if you follow us.
Can I say something as well quickly?
YouTube, yes.
I think the content's been great over the last few weeks. I think TyskySour has been great. Ash's videos have been going viral. Our articles are great. The podcasts are great. I think we do an amazing job for the money we get. If there is a general election, we want to be doing live stuff very regularly, maybe every night. I'm not going to hold Gary to that as a lot of work, but we're doing lots of live stuff, lots of responses, lots of podcasts, lots of articles. So help us get ready for that, right? Because if there is a general election, if there is a second referendum, we need to make sure that a socialist perspective on the left wins, that it prevails, because it's all to play for. And, massive changes coming, right, in the next 5 years, and we want to be a major part of shaping that.
And also, I don't want to see the left compromise to get into power. I want the ideas that we're talking about, which aren't just sort of tinkering with wealth redistribution, but fundamentally are pursuing wealth pre-distribution, ideas which are radically interrogating borders, policing, racism, political culture, that those are deep enough in the electorate that we don't have to make those kinds of compromises in order to get to power.
Daniel Eden has just written, I've got a job now, so I can donate an hour's wage. That is the spirit. Thank you. But anyway, we're going to go. So good night. Thank you for watching the show. I'll see you tomorrow, actually. And we have Philosophy Tube on the show. So that will be one not to miss. So see you tomorrow at 8 p.m.